Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of the disappearance of Agatha Christie. For 11 days in 1926, the world's greatest mystery writer became the mystery. One buried clue. One cold trail. One truth that Christie herself may have taken to her grave. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Opening meditation. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a city when it does not yet know what has happened inside it. Not the silence of peace. Not the silence of an ordinary evening. Something closer to the silence that comes just before understanding arrives, when the facts are all present, laid out in plain sight, and the mind has not yet assembled them into the shape they will eventually make. Newcastle upon Tyne, in the summer of 1968, knew that silence. It was a city that had buried a child without knowing how he died. It was a city that had read handwritten notes that said, in plain printed letters, "We did murder Martin Brown," and had looked away. It was a city that did not yet understand that the most important piece of the puzzle was not the child who had killed, but the home that child came from. Tonight, we are going to move slowly through this case. We are going to follow the evidence carefully, and we are going to sit with the questions that have never been fully answered. We are going to talk about two little boys whose lives ended in the summer of 1968. We are going to talk about the investigation that followed. And we are going to spend a great deal of time thinking about a question that was never properly asked in a British courtroom, a question about what had been done to a child long before that child ever harmed anyone else. There is no need to rush. The details will come, one at a time. Part 1, The Boy on the Floor. Here is something that does not fit. In May of 1968, a 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown was found dead on the floor of an abandoned house in the Scotswood area of Newcastle upon Tyne. The pathologist who examined him could not find a cause of death. He could not identify any signs of violence on the body. And so, officially, Martin Brown was recorded as a child who had died of nothing in particular, a tragic, unexplained loss, the kind that parents and communities sometimes have to absorb without the comfort of an answer. The question is this: how does a 4-year-old child die in an abandoned house, with blood and saliva at the corner of his mouth, and the cause of death remain unidentified? That question would not be answered for months. And when it finally was answered, the answer would reshape everything. Let us begin at the beginning. Scotswood was a working-class neighborhood in the West End of Newcastle, a community of terraced houses and narrow streets, of children who played outdoors because the houses were small and the summers were warm. The families who lived there knew each other's names, knew each other's children, watched the younger ones in the way that close-knit communities often do. It was the kind of street where a 4-year-old could walk to the corner shop and back without anyone thinking twice about it. Martin Brown was, by all accounts, an ordinary 4-year-old. He was small, lively, the kind of child who moved through the world with the unguarded energy that very young children carry naturally. On the afternoon of May 25, 1968, he left his home, walked to a nearby sweet shop, bought a piece of candy, and began making his way back. He never arrived. About 15 minutes after Martin left the shop, 3 older boys were exploring an abandoned terraced house on St. Margaret's Road, looking for scrap wood. It was the kind of errand that older children in that neighborhood ran regularly. Old timber was useful, and the abandoned houses on the street offered a ready supply. The boys climbed in through an accessible window and began searching the ground floor. Finding nothing of interest there, they made their way upstairs. In an upstairs bedroom, on the floor, they found Martin Brown. He was lying on his back. His arms were above his head. There was blood at the corner of his mouth, and a trail of saliva running down his cheek. He was still. The boys ran for help immediately. A workman in the area heard their shouts and came to the house, climbing the stairs to where Martin lay. He attempted resuscitation, pressing down carefully on the small chest, trying to find a breath, trying to find a heartbeat. There was nothing to find. Police arrived. Then an ambulance. Martin was taken to hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. The following day, a pathologist examined the body. His name was Bernard Knight, a man who would go on to become one of the most respected forensic pathologists in the United Kingdom, a figure whose later career would include the development of techniques now standard in forensic medicine. In 1968, he was thorough, methodical, and experienced. And he could not determine how Martin Brown had died. There was no obvious blunt force trauma. No visible bruising consistent with an attack. No toxicological finding that explained the death. The marks on the neck, the marks that strangling leaves, were, in Martin's case, apparently so faint, so carefully applied, that they did not present clearly to examination. It was a detail that would only make sense later, in retrospect, once the full picture emerged. Martin Brown was buried. The inquest recorded his death as unexplained. The community grieved in the way that communities grieve, with shock, with sadness, with the particular helplessness that comes from a death that carries no reason. No one in Scotswood, in May of 1968, was looking for a murderer. Because no one knew a murder had taken place. And somewhere in that neighborhood, the person responsible was watching the response. Watching the adults. Watching the door of Martin's mother's house. Waiting. That is where this story begins. Not with the discovery of a crime, but with the absence of one, with a death that was recorded as nothing, in a city that had not yet learned to look at what was in front of it. Part 2, The Notes. Here is the clue that does not fit. 2 days after Martin Brown was buried, someone broke into the local day nursery on Woodland Crescent. They had not come in through a door or a window left carelessly unlatched. They had climbed onto the roof and removed slate tiles, prying them up methodically, creating an opening large enough to drop through into the building below. Inside the nursery, the intruders spread ink and poster paint across the floor in broad smears. They moved through the rooms. And then they wrote 4 notes, which they left scattered around the building. 4 notes, in childish printed handwriting, alternating between 2 slightly different hands, as though 2 different people had taken turns with the pen. The notes read as follows. The 2nd, we did murder Martin Brown. The 3rd, watch out, there are murderers about. And a 4th, whose exact wording varied slightly across different accounts of the case, but which continued in the same vein, casual, boastful, oddly detached, written in the cramped print of a hand that had not yet fully learned joined-up writing. Newcastle police were called to the nursery that morning. Officers walked through the building, looked at the notes, examined the roof where the tiles had been removed, and came to a conclusion. The notes were a prank. A sick prank, they agreed, possibly by older teenagers, possibly by young people who had heard about Martin Brown's death and had decided, for reasons of cruelty or boredom or both, to exploit the grief of a neighborhood. The police installed a burglar alarm at the nursery and moved on to other matters. They did not submit the notes for forensic analysis. They did not connect them to Martin's death. They did not ask whether the phrase "we did murder Martin Brown" might, in fact, be a literal statement of fact. This is perhaps the moment in the investigation that is hardest to sit with, looking back. Not because the police were negligent in some straightforward sense, they were working within a framework that had already decided Martin's death was unexplained, not criminal. To suspect the notes were genuine, one would first have to suspect the death was a killing. And the official record said it was not. But the notes were genuine. And the handwriting in them, clear, printed, the work of a child's hand, was identifiable. 2 different children had written those notes. And if investigators had analyzed them at that point, in late May of 1968, 3-year-old Brian Howe might have lived. We cannot know that for certain. We can only know that the opportunity was there, and it was missed. 2 days after the nursery notes were written, an 11-year-old girl from the neighborhood knocked on the front door of Martin Brown's family home. Martin's mother, June Brown, answered the door. The girl smiled at her. She asked if she could see Martin. June Brown told her that Martin was dead. The girl's smile did not change. She said she knew he was dead. She said she wanted to see him in his coffin. June Brown closed the door. She would remember that smile for the rest of her life. The complete absence of discomfort in it. The girl's face entirely at ease, entirely pleasant, while she spoke words that no 11-year-old should have known how to form so calmly. The girl walked away down the street. No one filed a report. No one connected the visit to the nursery notes, or to Martin's death. In 1968, in Scotswood, an odd child doing an odd thing was simply noted and absorbed. The investigation, such as it was, rested. And 9 weeks passed. Part 3, 3 years old. Here is the question that opens this part of the story. What does an investigation look like when it does not yet know it is an investigation? In the weeks following Martin Brown's death and the nursery break-in, the Scotswood neighborhood continued its summer in the way that working-class communities in 1960s England continued their summers: children in the streets, doors left open in the heat, parents watching from windows and doorsteps, keeping a loose but genuine eye on the younger ones. It was within this ordinary summer that Brian Howe moved through his days. Brian was 3 years old. He lived with his family on a street not far from where Martin Brown had lived. He was small even for his age, a quiet, round-faced little boy who liked to follow his older sister when she would let him, and who otherwise explored the familiar streets in the way that very young children do, in small widening circles from the front door. On the afternoon of July 31, 1968, Brian walked out of his front door to play. He was seen in the street with his older sister and the family dog. He was seen, shortly afterward, in the company of children from the neighborhood. And then he was not seen. His sister came home without him. This was not immediately alarming. 3-year-olds in close-knit neighborhoods were sometimes absorbed by a neighbor's yard, or found sitting on a doorstep 2 streets over. His family waited, and then they began to look. As the afternoon moved toward evening, and Brian did not appear, the search widened. He was found in an area of wasteland not far from his home, in the early evening. He was lying in the long grass, on his back. He was dead. The response this time was different from the response to Martin Brown's death. Not because the investigators had learned anything in the intervening weeks. Brian's death came before anyone had re-examined what had happened to Martin. The difference was simply in what the body revealed. Because this time, the evidence of what had happened was visible. The pathologist who examined Brian Howe found marks on his neck consistent with manual strangulation, the careful, sustained pressure of hands that had deliberately cut off the air to his lungs. There were also other injuries, small puncture marks, cuts, evidence that something sharp had been used. Strands of grass and earth were pressed into his clothing, suggesting he had been moved slightly after death. Brian Howe had been murdered. That conclusion was immediate, and it set the investigation in motion in a way that Martin Brown's death had not. But there was something else. Something that the pathologist noted and the investigators found troubling in a specific, focused way. The injuries on Brian Howe's body, while consistent with strangulation, showed something unusual about the force applied. The marks were not those of an adult's hands. The pressure had been applied by smaller hands than those of a grown person, hands that had pressed steadily, carefully, with patience, but without the full leverage of adult strength. The investigators were looking for a child. That realization, once it settled, changed the nature of the entire inquiry. A door-to-door investigation was launched in the neighborhood. Officers spoke with families, with parents, with the children themselves. And in those conversations, several children mentioned names, the names of girls they had seen near the wasteland that afternoon, girls who had been with Brian shortly before he disappeared. 2 names came up repeatedly. One was Mary Bell, 11 years old. The other was a girl of 13, a friend and sometime companion of Mary's, who also lived in the neighborhood. Detectives noted both names and began to investigate further. Meanwhile, they turned their attention back to the beginning. Because the discovery that Brian Howe had been strangled, manually, by small hands, meant that the question of Martin Brown's death needed to be reconsidered. Bernard Knight was asked to review his original findings. And this time, looking again at the evidence, the conclusion shifted. Martin Brown had also been strangled. Which meant that Newcastle, in the summer of 1968, had a murderer in its streets. And the evidence was pointing, increasingly and unavoidably, toward the possibility that the murderer was a child. Part 4, The Investigation Turns. Here is the clue that changes everything. When detectives began speaking with Mary Bell in the days following Brian Howe's death, they noticed something almost immediately. Most children, when interviewed in connection with a serious incident, exhibit one of 2 recognizable responses. They become anxious, quiet, monosyllabic, frightened of saying the wrong thing. Or they become talkative in the way frightened children are talkative, offering more information than was asked for, circling the edges of what they know, seeking adult reassurance. Mary Bell did neither. She was calm. She was cooperative. She answered questions clearly and without apparent distress. And then, In the course of those early conversations, she said things that no child should have been able to say. She described the scene where Brian Howe's body had been found in specific terms that included details that had not been released to the public, details that were only known to the people who had examined the body and the scene. When asked how she knew these things, her explanations were vague, circular, and unconvincing. She had heard someone talking, she said. She had been told by someone. The explanations shifted. In one interview, she offered to take officers to the location where Brian had been found, and she led them there without hesitation, along a route that was specific and direct. When asked how she knew the way, the explanations again dissolved into vagueness. This pattern, specific knowledge presented casually, followed by unconvincing explanations for how the knowledge had been acquired, was one that experienced detectives recognized. It is a pattern that appears in false statements. But it is a particularly unusual version of that pattern, because most people who know details they shouldn't know either hide the knowledge carefully, or reveal it in a way that betrays their anxiety about having revealed it. Mary showed no anxiety. The knowledge appeared almost as though it had simply been absorbed, remembered, available to retrieve, like any other fact about any other ordinary topic. Detectives also spoke with the older girl whose name had been mentioned alongside Mary's. This girl, 13 years old, was considerably less composed than Mary. She was clearly frightened. She cried. She gave inconsistent accounts of where she had been and what she had seen. And over the course of several interviews, a picture began to emerge, a picture in which both girls had been present in the area where Brian was found, but in which the roles attributed to them by the evidence were very different. There was physical evidence to examine as well. On the day Brian's body was discovered, investigators had collected samples from the scene, fibers, hair, material that had been transferred to and from the body. Analysis of these samples produced results that connected the physical evidence to Mary Bell. There were also clues within the injuries themselves, the pattern of the marks on Brian's neck, the size and spacing of them, was consistent with hands of a specific size. Investigators worked to establish what those dimensions suggested about the person responsible. And then there were the nursery notes. The 4 notes from the Woodland Crescent break-in, which had been set aside in late May as a tasteless prank, were now retrieved and examined properly. Forensic document analysis was applied, the handwriting was analyzed, the paper examined, the printing style compared against known samples. The analysis produced a match. The notes had been written by Mary Bell and the older girl. "We did murder Martin Brown," written in a child's printed hand. Left in an empty building 2 days after a 4-year-old died and his death was recorded as unexplained. The note had been telling the truth all along. Mary Bell and the older girl were taken into custody and questioned formally. The older girl's account, over time and across multiple interviews, became increasingly specific about what she had and had not done. She maintained that she had been present but had not participated, that she had watched, and had been frightened, and had not known how to stop what was happening. Investigators and the eventual legal proceedings would assess the credibility of that account carefully. The evidence against the older girl was substantially different in character from the evidence against Mary. The forensic findings, the knowledge displayed in interviews, the specific details known only to someone directly involved, these pointed clearly to Mary. Mary Bell was formally charged with the murders of Martin Brown and Brian Howe. The older girl was charged as well, with the prosecution arguing that her presence and participation made her complicit. The trial was set for December 1968. And as Newcastle prepared to watch two children stand before a court, the country began to ask a question it did not know how to answer. How does an 11-year-old child kill? That question, as it turned out, had an answer. But the answer required looking at a set of facts that the court would never fully hear. Part 5. What the court did not know. Here is the question at the heart of this part of the story. When 4 court-appointed psychiatrists evaluated Mary Bell in 1968, they reached a conclusion that was, given the information available to them, understandable. They concluded that Mary displayed the characteristics consistent with psychopathy, a clinical term that, in 1968, carried a specific and fairly narrow meaning in forensic psychiatry. She was, they said, a child who lacked normal empathy, who was capable of harming others without apparent remorse, whose emotional responses were consistently flat or inappropriate in contexts where distress would normally be expected. The diagnosis was documented, presented at trial, and became the framework through which Mary Bell was understood, publicly, legally, and medically, for many years. What those 4 psychiatrists did not know, because they were never told, was what had been happening to Mary Bell inside her own home since she was approximately 4 years old. Mary's mother was a woman named Betty Bell. Betty Bell was a sex worker who operated primarily in Glasgow, returning to Newcastle periodically, her presence in Mary's life irregular and destabilizing from the earliest years. The relationship between Betty and Mary was not one that any professional examining Mary in 1968 appears to have investigated in any depth. The defense team did not present evidence about Betty Bell's conduct toward her daughter. The prosecution did not explore the home environment as a factor in Mary's development. The court did not hear what Mary's early life had actually contained. What we know about Betty Bell's conduct toward Mary came later, primarily through investigative journalism and, eventually, through Mary's own account, which she gave to the journalist Gitta Sereni for a book published in 1998, 30 years after the trial. The picture that emerged from that account, from interviews with people who had known the family, and from contemporaneous social services records that were reviewed in later years, is one of sustained and deliberate harm. Betty Bell, according to multiple sources, had been attempting to harm Mary, possibly to kill her, from the earliest years of Mary's life. There were incidents involving what appeared to be deliberate overdoses of medication. There were accounts of Mary being put in situations of physical danger. There were multiple occasions on which Mary was found in a state of medical crisis that was attributed, at the time, to accident or illness, but which later analysis suggested were not accidental. And there was something else, something that Mary herself described, and which the journalist Sereni found corroborated by other sources. Betty Bell had, from the time Mary was approximately 4 years old, been deliberately exposing her daughter to situations of sexual abuse. Betty brought men into contact with Mary in ways that were arranged rather than accidental. The abuse, by Mary's account, was ongoing and deliberate, and Betty Bell was not merely passive in it. The clinical picture of a child who had experienced this, beginning at age 4, continuing across the years of her development up to and including the time of the killings, is not the clinical picture of a child who was born without the capacity for empathy. It is the clinical picture of a child who has been systematically destroyed. The neurological and psychological research on early childhood trauma, research that was not available in anything like its current depth in 1968, is now extensive on this point. Sustained trauma in early childhood, particularly trauma that is sexual and that involves the betrayal of a primary caregiver, produces measurable changes in brain development. It disrupts the formation of normal attachment. It interferes with the development of emotional regulation. It produces, in many cases, exactly the constellation of symptoms that was identified in Mary Bell by those 4 psychiatrists and labeled as psychopathy. In other words, the child that the court saw, flat affect, no apparent remorse, calm in circumstances where distress would be expected, was very likely not a child who had been born that way. She was a child who had been made that way, methodically and over years, by the person who was supposed to protect her. The court did not hear this. The psychiatrists did not know it. And so the question, the actual question, the one that might have changed the entire framing of the trial and its outcome, was never asked in the courtroom. Why did Mary Bell not show remorse? Perhaps because from the time she was 4 years old, she had been taught, by the person she depended on most completely, that her distress was not relevant. That her pain was not real, or not important, or not the kind of thing that would be acknowledged. A child raised in that environment does not learn to recognize emotional pain, not in others, and not in herself, because the emotional landscape she was taught to navigate did not have room for it. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. Because it does not change what happened to Martin Brown and Brian Howe. It does not reduce the reality of their deaths or the grief of their families. It simply means that the story the court told about Mary Bell in 1968 was incomplete in a way that mattered, deeply, structurally, irretrievably mattered, to what was done with her afterward. Part 6, The Trial. Here is something worth sitting with as we move into the legal proceedings. A criminal trial, by its nature, is a mechanism for establishing what happened and determining how to respond. It is not, primarily, a mechanism for understanding why. The question of why belongs to psychiatry, to social work, to the longer and more patient inquiry that happens outside the courtroom. The courtroom asks, did this person do this thing? And if so, what should be done about it? In December of 1968, those questions were placed before a Newcastle court with respect to 2 children, Mary Bell, now 11 years old, and the older girl, now 13. The trial attracted enormous attention. Britain had never prosecuted a child of Mary's age for murder. The newspapers covered the proceedings daily. The public was fascinated and disturbed in equal measure, a fascination that was not, it should be acknowledged, always handled with the care that the situation deserved. The press of 1968 did not have the legal protections that now exist around the identity and reporting of child defendants. Mary Bell's name, her photograph, her address, and extensive details of her life were published widely. The girl who was tried alongside her was similarly identified. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented its case in detail. The forensic evidence was laid out, the physical evidence connecting Mary to the scene of Brian Howe's death, the handwriting analysis matching her hand to the nursery notes, the specific knowledge she had displayed in interviews about details that were not public. The testimony of the older girl was also before the court, in the form of the statements she had given to investigators, statements in which she described being present at the scene of Brian's death, and in which she attributed what had happened entirely to Mary. The defense, for its part, contested the reliability of some of the evidence and challenged the interview process, arguing, with some justification, that the interviews of two child suspects had not been conducted with the procedural care that the situation required. Police interviews of children in 1968 were not conducted with anything like the protections and guidance that are now standard. The sessions were lengthy. They took place without appropriate adult presence in some cases. And the psychological pressure of a formal police interview on an 11-year-old, even one as apparently composed as Mary, was not given significant weight. What the defense did not do, and this is the gap that has occupied researchers and forensic historians for decades, was present any evidence about Mary Bell's home life. The circumstances of her upbringing. What Betty Bell had done. The repeated incidents that social services records would later reveal had been noted, and not acted upon, across the years of Mary's childhood. There are different explanations offered for this absence. One is that the defense team genuinely did not know the extent of what had occurred, that Mary had not disclosed it, and that no one had pressed hard enough to find it. Another explanation, offered by some who have examined the case, is that the decision was made strategically, that raising the question of Mary's home life risked opening a line of inquiry that the defense could not fully control, and that in 1968, the tools for presenting childhood trauma as a legal mitigating factor simply did not exist in any coherent form. There was no established legal framework for arguing that what a child had suffered made her less culpable for what she had done. The psychiatric language for it was not yet developed. And so the court saw only what was presented. It saw a child who had strangled two younger children and who showed no apparent remorse for having done so. It saw the nursery notes, casual, almost amused in their tone. It heard the psychiatric testimony that described her as a psychopath. And it reached a verdict. Mary Bell was found guilty of the manslaughter of both Martin Brown and Brian Howe. The verdict of manslaughter rather than murder reflected the court's acceptance of the diminished responsibility argument, the acknowledgement that the psychiatric findings had some bearing on the degree of her culpability, even if the full picture of her life had not been placed before the court. She was sentenced to detention for life, an indeterminate sentence that, in practice, meant she would be held in a secure institution for as long as the relevant authorities considered it necessary, with periodic review. The older girl was acquitted. The jury found that the evidence against her did not establish, beyond reasonable doubt, that she had been anything more than a witness. Mary Bell, 11 years old, was taken from the courtroom and transported to a secure institution. And the question that had not been asked in court, the question about what had been done to her, settled into the kind of silence that difficult questions sometimes inhabit for many years before someone thinks to look for them. Part 7. Inside the Institutions. Here is the detail that does not fit the shape of the story that was publicly told. Mary Bell spent her childhood, her adolescence, and the early years of her adult life in a series of institutions. The first was a remand home, then a secure facility. She was too young, and her case too unusual, for the existing prison infrastructure. The question of where to place a convicted child killer who was not yet 12 years old was one for which Britain in 1968 had no established answer. She was eventually housed in a special unit, in conditions that were neither comfortable nor, it must be said, designed with any particular therapeutic framework in mind. The understanding of what children who had experienced severe early trauma needed in order to recover was not, in 1968, what it has since become. Treatment models were limited. The emphasis was on containment rather than rehabilitation, because the vocabulary of rehabilitation, what it meant, what it required, how it was measured, was not well developed in the context of a case like hers. There are accounts, from those who worked with Mary during this period, that describe a child who was capable of genuine engagement, with education, with the staff who showed her consistent kindness, with the structure of the routines that the institution provided. There are also accounts of a child who struggled significantly with periods of what appeared to be acute distress, who could be difficult and unpredictable, who sometimes seemed to be entirely without feeling and at other times showed evidence of something very much like it. This inconsistency is, again, consistent with what we now understand about the effects of early trauma. Trauma does not produce a consistent presentation. It produces a person who moves between states, between a kind of protective flatness and an overwhelming of emotion, because the regulatory systems that allow most people to modulate their emotional responses were never properly established. Mary's emotional world, to whatever extent the people around her could see into it, was not the world of someone who had never felt anything. It was the world of someone who had been taught, very early, that feeling was dangerous. Betty Bell remained a presence in Mary's life during the years of her detention, in the form of occasional visits and correspondence. Those visits, by accounts from staff who observed them, were difficult for Mary. Betty Bell's behavior toward her daughter, even within the formal, supervised context of an institutional visiting room, retained characteristics that caused concern. There is a documented account of at least one visit during which Betty Bell's conduct was sufficiently alarming that staff intervened. The source of Mary's harm was not something she had escaped by being removed from the street. It arrived at the visiting room and sat across the table from her and continued, in its attenuated institutional form, to be part of her life. Mary Bell was released from detention in 1980, when she was 23 years old. She was given a new identity, a new name, a new history in official documents, and released into the community with, by contemporary accounts, very little in the way of ongoing support. The infrastructure for supporting a person with her background and her particular needs as she re-entered ordinary life was not robust. She was essentially released and left to navigate the world with the tools she had, which were the tools of someone who had survived a childhood that would have destroyed many adults. In the years that followed her release, she made efforts, sustained, by all accounts sincere efforts, to live a life that was ordinary. She formed relationships. She had a daughter, born in 1984. She worked. She changed her name more than once as the press, at various points, discovered where she was living and published details that threatened to expose her new identity. Each exposure meant another move, another disruption, another uprooting of whatever had begun to settle. Her daughter, who had been raised without knowing her mother's history, learned of it through the press coverage that surrounded the book's publication. That disclosure, and its effects on their relationship, is one of the quieter tragedies in a case that contains many of them. Part 8, Betty Bell. Here is the question that this entire case eventually forces us to ask. If what has been documented about Betty Bell's conduct is accurate, and there is a substantial body of evidence suggesting that it is, then the person most responsible for the conditions that produced the events of 1968 was never prosecuted for anything. Betty Bell died in 2003. She was never charged with any offense in connection with her treatment of Mary. The information about her conduct that emerged in the years following Mary's release was examined by journalists, by academics, and by people who study child welfare and criminal justice. But it did not result in legal proceedings. There are structural reasons for this. The statute of limitations on certain offenses. The evidentiary challenges of prosecuting historic abuse when the key witness is the adult survivor of that abuse. The general difficulty, in the British legal system of the 20th century, of building cases around child sexual abuse that occurred within the family, a difficulty that was not unique to this case but was endemic to the era. But there is something beyond the legal and structural that is worth sitting with. Betty Bell's conduct toward Mary was known, not fully, not in the detail that would later emerge, but in outline, to institutions that had the power to intervene. Social services records from Mary's early childhood contain notations about concerns regarding her home situation. There were visits. There were assessments. There were moments at which someone in a professional capacity stood at the edge of what was happening in that house and then turned away, because the threshold for intervention was high, because the capacity to help was limited, because the system that was supposed to protect children like Mary was not equipped to see what it was looking at. Martin Brown was 4 years old. Brian Howe was 3 years old. And Mary Bell was, by any coherent accounting, a victim long before she was a perpetrator. A victim of a woman who was never held accountable for what she did. This is not an argument that what Mary did was acceptable, or that the families of Martin and Brian should be expected to carry any particular understanding or forgiveness. Those families, June Brown, the Howe family, lived with loss that was real and permanent, that did not diminish because the person who caused it was herself a victim of a different crime. Grief does not work on a scale of comparative suffering. The death of a 4-year-old is not made smaller by the suffering of the child who killed him. What it is an argument for, or rather, what the evidence of this case suggests, is that the question of how a child comes to be capable of killing is a question that reaches back, always, into what was done to that child. And when the institutions around a child can see the early evidence of what is being done to them, and do not act, the moral calculus of responsibility is not simple. It is distributed. It falls in different weights on different parties. Betty Bell carried a weight of it that was never formally assessed. The social systems that saw early warning signs and did not act carried some of it as well. And the legal system that evaluated Mary Bell in 1968 without ever hearing the central fact of her life carried its own share. None of that accounting changes what happened to Martin and Brian. But it is part of the story. It is, arguably, the most important part, because it is the part that, if attended to, might have prevented the story from happening at all. Part 9, The Families. Here is where we slow down further, and sit with the people who have been present in the background of this case from the very beginning. June Brown opened her front door one afternoon and found a smiling girl asking to see her dead son in his coffin. She closed the door. She carried that image, that smile, for decades. The loss of Martin, compounded by the specific and particular horror of the circumstances surrounding his death, was not the kind of loss that is softened by the passage of time in the ordinary way. It is the kind that becomes part of the permanent architecture of a life. The Brown family's experience of the trial and its aftermath was, by various accounts, painful in ways that extended beyond the grief of Martin's death. The public attention, the press coverage, the exposure of private details in the course of legal proceedings, all of this was experienced without the support structures that would now, in the 21st century, be considered standard for the families of murder victims. There was no family liaison officer in any modern sense. There was no victim support organization with experience of cases of this kind. There was the community, and there was the church, and there was the particular resilience that working-class families in 1960s Newcastle had developed through necessity. The Howe family's experience was similarly difficult. Brian was 3 years old when he walked out of his front door and did not come back. His older sister had been the last family member to see him, a detail that carried its own terrible weight. Children who experience the death of a sibling in violent circumstances carry that experience into their adulthood in ways that are not always visible and not always spoken about. Both families spoke, at various points over the years, about the complexity of their feelings regarding Mary Bell. Not uniformly, and not in ways that fit neatly into any simple category of forgiveness or its absence. The feelings of people who have lost a child to violence are not simple, and they do not remain static over 50 years. They change, and they contain contradictions, and they do not resolve into a clean narrative. What the families consistently asked for, across the years of press coverage, the publication of books, the various moments when the case returned to public attention, was a particular kind of consideration. Not for their feelings to be uncomplicated. Not for anyone to tell them how to grieve. Simply for the recognition that their loss was real and permanent, that it existed at the center of this story, and that it should not be crowded out by the various other narratives that accumulated around the case over time. That is a request that deserves to be honored. Martin Brown was 4 years old. He walked to a sweet shop, bought a piece of candy, and started walking home. Brian Howe was 3 years old. He walked out of his front door to play on a summer afternoon. They are not background figures in a story about someone else. They are the beginning and the center of this story, and the grief of the people who loved them is the emotional truth around which everything else is arranged. Part 10, The Question of Psychopathy. Here is the detail that has shifted significantly in the 55 years since those 4 psychiatrists submitted their report. In 1968, the diagnosis of psychopathy was applied relatively broadly and with relatively limited precision. The clinical tools available for assessing personality disorder in children were not sophisticated by modern standards. The diagnostic criteria were less nuanced, the research base was smaller, and the specific question of how to distinguish between a child who had been born with a significantly different neurological profile and a child whose neurological development had been disrupted by sustained trauma was not one that the field had developed reliable methods for answering. The 4 psychiatrists who assessed Mary Bell were working at the limits of what their field could offer in 1968. This is not a criticism of their competence. It is simply an acknowledgement that science has limits that move over time, and that those limits have moved considerably in the decades since. The contemporary research picture on what is now called conduct disorder and antisocial personality disorder, the diagnostic categories that have, in large part, replaced the older usage of psychopathy in clinical settings, is substantially more sophisticated. And one of the things that research has established more clearly is the relationship between early childhood trauma, particularly early relational trauma, and the development of symptoms that can appear identical to the constitutional profile once labeled psychopathic. Studies of children who have experienced severe early abuse, particularly abuse that begins before age 5 and that involves the primary caregiver, consistently show disruptions to attachment, to emotional regulation, to the capacity for empathy, to the ability to read and respond to social cues in normative ways. These disruptions, in their more severe presentations, produce children who appear to lack the normal emotional range, who are calm in situations that would distress most people, who can engage socially in a superficially appropriate way without the underlying emotional connection that normally accompanies social behavior. In other words, the clinical presentation that was documented in Mary Bell by the court-appointed psychiatrists is a presentation that is entirely consistent with the effects of exactly the kind of early abuse that Mary experienced. And it is a presentation that, in many children, is not static. It is responsive to sustained, skilled, therapeutic intervention, particularly when that intervention begins relatively early. Mary Bell received no sustained therapeutic intervention in the early years of her detention. The institutions in which she was housed were not equipped to provide it, and the therapeutic frameworks that would have been necessary did not exist in developed form in Britain in the 1960s. What might have been possible if the court in 1968 had heard the evidence about Betty Bell's conduct? If the psychiatric assessment had been conducted with knowledge of the full picture of Mary's early life? If the sentence had been structured around therapeutic intervention rather than secure containment? We cannot know. These are counterfactuals, and history does not run backward. But they are worth asking, not as exercises in revisionism, but as questions that might inform how similar cases are handled in the future. And there have been similar cases since 1968. Children who have killed other children. Children whose violence emerged from homes in which they were the first victims. Children who were assessed by courts and by psychiatrists without the full picture of their early lives before the professionals who were trying to make sense of them. The Mary Bell case is not simply a historical curiosity. It is a case that asks a set of questions about how societies understand child violence, and those questions remain relevant. Part 11, Legacy and Reckoning. Here is the question that this part of the story invites. What does a society owe to a child who has been made, by systematic abuse, into a person capable of harm? And how does it balance that obligation against its obligation to the children who were harmed? These are not questions with easy answers. They are not questions that resolve cleanly into policy positions or legal frameworks, though they have implications for both. They are, at their core, moral questions, questions about culpability, about responsibility, about the limits of individual accountability when individual development has been so profoundly distorted by circumstances the individual did not choose. Britain has grappled with these questions in various forms since 1968. The Mary Bell case was an early and extreme example of a problem that the legal system and the child welfare system have continued to encounter in different forms. Children who harm other children. Children whose violence is the visible expression of invisible wounds. Children who arrive at the moment of harm having already been through something that most adults could not survive. The legal age of criminal responsibility in England and Wales, at the time of Mary Bell's trial, was 8 years old. It has since been raised to 10, which is still among the lowest in Western Europe. The debate about that threshold, about what it means to hold a child criminally responsible, about what culpability actually requires in terms of understanding and maturity, is a debate that the Bell case helped to initiate, though it has not yet produced a settled conclusion. The children who have been convicted of serious crimes in Britain since 1968, and there have been a number of cases that raised similar questions, some of which are well known, have been handled with varying degrees of sophistication. Some have been offered therapeutic environments and skilled support. Some have been managed primarily through containment. The outcomes have varied accordingly. The research on what produces better outcomes for children who have committed serious offenses is clear on a few points. Early, skilled, sustained therapeutic intervention that addresses the underlying trauma rather than simply managing the presenting behavior, produces better outcomes than containment alone. A legal framework that is capable of acknowledging the context of a child's development, rather than treating that development as legally irrelevant, produces more just results and, in the long run, more effective ones. These are not radical conclusions. They are the conclusions that the evidence, accumulated across decades of research and practice, supports. But they require an investment, of resources, of expertise, of political will, that societies do not always find it easy to make, particularly in cases that attract the kind of public revulsion that cases of child violence typically attract. The revulsion is understandable. It is human. When a child dies at the hands of another child, the emotional response of a community is not measured or academic. It is raw and it is protective, and it does not naturally run toward the question of what the perpetrator's early life contained. That question feels, in the immediate aftermath of violence, like a form of excuse-making. Like a distraction from the central wrong. But the question is not an excuse. It is an explanation. And explanations, unlike excuses, do not reduce the reality of the harm that was done. They simply add a second layer of reality, the reality of how the harm came to be possible, which is essential if any effort to prevent similar harm in the future is going to be grounded in something other than punishment and hope. Martin Brown and Brian Howe deserved better from the systems that were supposed to protect children in Scotswood in 1968. That is true. And Mary Bell deserved better from those same systems, years before the summer of 1968, when there was still time to intervene. That is also true. Both things are true. They do not cancel each other out. Part 12, where the story leaves us. Here is where we arrive, after all of this. 56 years have passed since a 4-year-old boy walked into an abandoned house on St. Margaret's Road and did not walk back out. 56 years since a 3-year-old stepped off his front doorstep into a summer afternoon that ended in the long grass of a wasteland lot. 56 years since a city read handwritten notes that told it the truth and decided, for reasons that seemed logical at the time, that the truth could not be what it appeared to be. Mary Bell is in her late 60s now. She has lived under assumed names for most of her adult life. She has, by the accounts available, made a sustained effort to live quietly and carefully, to build relationships that are real and maintained, to be something other than what she was at 11 years old in a neighborhood that no longer exists in its 1968 form. Whether that effort constitutes redemption, and whether redemption is even the right category to apply, is a question that different people will answer differently, depending on what they bring to it. The families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe have the strongest claim to an opinion on that question, and their opinions have been complex and have changed over time, as opinions formed in the crucible of real grief and real loss tend to do. What seems clear, from the long view of this case, is that the summer of 1968 in Scotswood was the culmination of a sequence that had begun years earlier and had multiple points at which it might have been interrupted. Each of those points of possible interruption involved an institution, a professional, a system, a doctor, a social worker, a school, a health visitor, that was in some position to see what was happening and did not see it clearly enough, or did not have the tools to act on what it saw, or acted and found that the action was not sufficient. That is a difficult thing to accept about institutions and systems that exist specifically to prevent this kind of harm. But it is true, and it is the kind of truth that systems can only learn by being willing to look at their own failures honestly. The Bernard Knight finding, or rather, the initial non-finding, that Martin Brown had died of nothing in particular, that was a failure of knowledge, not competence. The science of forensic pathology has advanced significantly since 1968, specifically in the area of identifying the signs of manual strangulation in small victims. Knight later acknowledged, with the honesty of a scientist reviewing his earlier work in light of what was subsequently established, that the signs had been there and had not been read correctly. The police decision to dismiss the nursery notes as a prank, that was a failure of connection, of the willingness to consider a possibility that felt too disturbing to take seriously. A child had written "We did murder Martin Brown," and the system looked at it and said, "This cannot mean what it says." The gap between what the note said and what the official record said had made the note's literal meaning feel impossible. The defense's failure to present the evidence of Betty Bell's conduct, that was a failure of multiple systems simultaneously, the social services that held records of concern, the investigators who did not press deeply enough into Mary's background, the legal framework that offered no established mechanism for translating a childhood of sustained abuse into a mitigating factor, and the psychiatric assessment that concluded psychopathy without the full picture, that was a failure of information. Not of skill or of care, but of access to the central fact of the case. In 1968, in a city that did not yet know what it was looking at, all of these failures compounded each other in sequence. The result was 2 dead children, and a third child who was convicted in a court that never fully understood her, sentenced in a system that was not equipped to help her, and released into a world that continued to hunt her through the decades that followed. There is no clean ending to this story. True stories rarely have them. What there is, instead, is a long accumulation of things that were missed, and a gradual, very gradual, process of understanding what it would have meant to see them clearly. Martin Brown. 4 years old. Brian Howe. 3 years old. Their names are the ones this case is built around, and they should not be forgotten. And the question that the case also keeps asking, about what produces a child capable of harm, and what it costs a society to ignore the early signs of that production, is one that remains open. Not because it cannot be answered, but because answering it requires a level of sustained, honest attention that is difficult to maintain in the face of the emotions that cases like this one naturally produce. Attention is what is owed to the victims, to the evidence, to the parts of the story that are hardest to look at. That is what serious examination of a case like this one asks for. And it is what, tonight, we have tried to give it. Closing meditation. We have come a long way through this story tonight. From a May afternoon in 1968, through the weeks and months of an investigation that found its answers slowly, through a courtroom that heard some of the truth but not all of it, through the years that followed. Stories like this one do not resolve in the way we might wish. They settle, gradually, into a different kind of understanding, one that holds multiple truths at once, that does not require simplification in order to make sense. 2 children died. Their families carried that loss for the rest of their lives. A third child, who had been living inside a different kind of harm since before she could speak about it, did the unforgivable and was not fully understood when she did. And the systems that might have prevented all of it looked at the early evidence and found reasons to look away. We look at it now. Not to judge, though some judgment is appropriate and necessary. Not to excuse, because the harm that was done to Martin and Brian cannot be excused. But to understand, to hold the full shape of the story, all its complexity, its sadness, its unanswered questions. That is what honest examination asks of us. And it is, perhaps, the quietest form of respect we can offer to everyone that this story belongs to. Thank you for sitting with this tonight. Rest well. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?